Hello, my name is Andrew Jason, and today I'm going to be talking about a paper that I presented at a couple conferences. The title is Hold the Bets, Do Quasi and True Experimental Evaluations Yield Equally Valid Impact Results When Effect Generalization is the Goal? The aims are to give a short demonstration of the conditions under which quasi-experimental designs, especially non-equivalent comparison group designs, are systematically less biased from selection than are randomized control trials. I'll discuss the implications of this idea for the prioritization of internal and external validity. And by that, I think one of the challenges that I'm trying to present here to you is to reimagine the relationship between these two forms of validity. And hopefully, some of the arguments in this paper will help to encourage discussion on that point. And number three, as we go, I'll address several constructive critiques that I've received as feedback in presenting this paper. So first, I'm going to give a short demonstration of the conditions under which the quasi-experimental designs are systematically less biased from selection than RCTs are. One thing I want to keep in mind here is that the presentation that I'm going to give here and the visual argument that I'm going to make is should be considered sort of as an idealized case. We're going to assume there's no attrition of cases, that measures are reliable, and so on. And this will help us get to the main ideas, I think, more effectively. And then later we will reconsider some of these additional constraints that must be taken into account when estimation is involved. Okay, so I'll consider four scenarios, and across all four scenarios, the goal is to establish the average causal impact of a program at site D equals 0. Okay, scenario one, which is displayed here, is the ideal. We're going to assume that we've accomplished randomization of persons within the site, for example, randomization of students, as well as potentially teachers into conditions, into treatment and control, as was, for example, possible in the class size reduction experiment that was done in Tennessee and is often referred to as sort of the exemplar for research and education. In this figure, the average impact for the inference site D equals 0 is represented by the length of the green line. In all three scenarios that I'm going to address, I represent the observed quantities that are used to infer impact at D equals 0 using the purple circles, as you see here. In this scenario, we get to observe exactly what we want to see, the average performance of individuals randomized to each of the conditions, which yields an unbiased estimate of the average impact of the program for this site. So we can quickly summarize this scenario. The causal quantity of interest is the average causal impact at D equals 0. The missing component, we're going to assume there are no missing components. We get to observe performance in both conditions following randomization. The quantity used to estimate the impact is the difference between the randomized groups at the inference site at D equals 0. And we use the term XP to denote experimental. And we assume there's no bias in the result. Scenario two is a standard case in research and evaluation. We observe performance in the treatment condition, which is represented by the black bar at the top of the inference site D equals 0, but we cannot observe impact in the absence of treatment. And the missing quantity is represented by the empty bar at the bottom of D equals 0. This would be the case, for example, if everyone at site D equals 0 receives the program. Under scenario two, option one, we seek to replicate what would be the experimental counterfactual using the observed performance of a comparison group from somewhere else, from D equals 1. And this is represented by the black bar on the right side of the picture. This is a very standard type of design, the non-equivalent comparison group design, where we must rely on making a comparison or looking for a counterfactual to treatment somewhere else because we just simply do not have a control group, idealized control group, as we would achieve through random assignment. Bias in the impact impact quantity based on the non-experimental cross-site comparison is the length of the blue line here. And it's actually the difference between the impact measured through the non-experimental comparison, the length of the red line, and the true impact at d equals 0, which is represented by the length of the green line. We will label this IV bias for internal validity bias. And as I mentioned, this quantity is often interpreted as standard selection bias resulting from persons selecting into two sites, with bias reflecting imbalance on person characteristics that affect the outcome. What we label IV bias is the focus of a line of research, the so-called within-study comparison studies. I'll refer to them a couple of times, and I'll just say WSC studies. And this research evaluates the potential for various non-experimental study designs to replicate the unbiased causal effects from movements. In the research described in this presentation, we build on this WSC tradition, and we will refer to it again later, as I noted. It's noteworthy that in this example, selection bias, that is IV bias, is characterized by the difference between a true control and a non-experimental comparison group in their average performance. Performance in the treatment condition is not considered. It's essentially difference the way. And this is brought up quite often in discussions of WSC studies. And it's an idea that anticipates the questions of whether this characterization of bias is sufficient when the goal is to generalize causal impacts. And I don't see scenario 2, option 1, that we have in front of us here as addressing a problem of causal generalization. We summarize scenario 2, option 1. The causal quantity of interest is the same as before. The average causal effect at d equals 0. The missing component is performance in the absence of treatment at the inference site. And the quantity used to infer impact is the difference that we just discussed. Bias is the difference between the inference and comparison sites in the average performance in the absence of treatment, what we refer to as IV bias. Scenario 2, option 2 starts off the same way as option 1 did. That is, we would like to accurately infer impact at inference site d equals 0, but there is no information about performance in the absence of treatment for that site. The control group is missing. With option 2, we choose to infer the impact quantity using the results from an uncompromised experiment conducted at a different comparison site, that is, at d equals 1. The magnitude of bias, in this case, is, again, the blue line. It represents the difference between the true impact at the comparison site, the length of the red line, and the true impact at the inference site, the length of the green line. And we will refer to this as EB bias for external validity bias. So here's the summary for this scenario, that is scenario 2, option 2. The causal quantity of interest is the same as before. The average causal effect at d equals 0. The missing component is the same as for option 1, performance in the absence of treatment at the inference site. And the quantity to use to infer impact at d equals 0 is the impact at site d equals 1. Bias is the difference between sites in their average impacts. It's useful to consider the potential sources of bias in the last scenario and this one. In scenario 2, option 1, bias is attributable to confounded selection into sites that affects average performance in the absence of treatment. Whereas in scenario 2, option 2, which we just looked at, bias is attributable to confounded selection into sites on moderators of impact, that is, on baseline characteristics of individuals that are associated with changes of impact, and therefore which cause impacts to vary across sites. There's a trade-off between these two options that we've just been talking about. With option 2, you give up some information at your inference site. That is, you actually have half the solution at your inference site, which is the average performance in the presence of treatment, under assignment to treatment. And here you've given up that information, and instead you're using information from over there, from the other side, from d equals 1. So really, it is kind of a trade-off between having an uncompromised experimental result from somewhere else versus having a potentially compromised result from selection, but where you have the true half of the true solution for your inference site. That is, you see the performance under assignment to treatment in this case. So given that, a preference for option 2 represents a belief the bias from selection on confounders affecting average achievement is greater than bias from selection on moderators of impact. We'll return to this point later because it's important for this for the discussion that we get into. Another point that's noteworthy here is that WSC studies seem to be kind of the right sort of a research approach to empirically testing the question of whether the first or the second option is better in the sense of being less biased. Okay, now we're going to switch to scenario 3. The main goal is the same as before, again, to infer impact at site D equals 0. However, there's a change of situation at the inference site. Specifically, there is a reversal in what is known. We now assume that we observe performance in the absence of treatment, but not in the presence of treatment. This is represented by the solid bar now being at the bottom, so it's shifted to the bottom, and the empty bar being at the top, indicating the unknown quantity. To me, this represents a very standard real-world situation where an administrator at site B equals 0 has not yet used the program, but wants to infer what the impact would be if the program had been used. The scenario here seems very straightforward for me, yet a researcher colleague of mine did raise an objection, and I'll call this person the objecting researcher, and they'll bring up several concerns, and I will respond to each of them. And this objecting researcher has questioned the validity of this, and I think that this requires a deeper response. So I'll go on a bit of a digression, but I think it is important to address. The critique is that this scenario and the problem posed is irrelevant to how empirical research on causality proceeds. It should be about what we looked at under scenario 2. In that case, you observe performance under assignment to treatment for the inference group, and the problem is to find a valid counterfactual to that. It's not clear to me where this critique comes from. It seems to me that both scenarios arise in the real world and are deserving of scientific study. I speculate that this objection signals a divide between the world of the pure researcher and the world of the program impact evaluator. That is, in how problems present themselves. I would argue that when non-experimental comparisons are called for to evaluate program impact, the researcher typically starts with a sample of program users and then looks for a similar sample of non-users to infer what the outcome would be in the absence of treatment. That is, to infer performance that is the counterfactual to treatment. On the other hand, the program evaluator always finds him or herself in very much the opposite situation. A local stakeholder identifies a specific sample of non-users, say for a specific school or a district, and expects the evaluator to assess the potential impact of the program for that specific sample before they decide to roll it out. The goal is to infer what the outcome would be if the treatment were used. That is, to infer performance that is the counterfactual to the control. Essentially, the situation is flipped. And I would, anecdotally, I just would say that when I was a third grade teacher in California, these are the kinds of situations that would arise. We were in a school that was receiving Title I funds, and there was another school that was very similar to ours demographically in terms of location, and they were using Success for All, and we were not. And at the end of the year, it was very natural to look at scores in at our site, so which would be sort of represented by site D equals 0 here, and then look to make a comparison elsewhere. And since a randomized trial was not conducted at that other site, we might compare our performance in the absence of Success for All to performance at the other location where they've used Success for All. And that kind of serves as a kind of implicit counterfactual to us, how we might have done had we used the program. Okay, so scenario 3, option 1. Let's look at what our solutions are when we encounter scenario 3. The first option is the same one that we observed under scenario 2. option 2. It involves using the result from an experiment conducted at a different site, d equals 1, to infer impact at d equals 0. The magnitude of bias is still the difference between the lengths of the red and the green lines as we had before. So the situation is unchanged from scenario 2, option 2. Presumably, this kind of solution of using evidence from effectiveness studies done elsewhere, ideally, you'd have a randomized experiment from elsewhere, and so it would satisfy the tier 1 evidence requirements. But you could also might use a quasi-experiment conducted somewhere else. That this is the kind of information that one might be expected to rely on when turning to evidence clearinghouses like the Whatworks Clearinghouse, and where the expectation is that decision makers will use evidence from experiments or quasi-experiments done elsewhere to guide their decisions about local program adoptions in places not yet using the program, or in situations where an administrator may be looking to change up their program. It's about the potential for what might happen locally. So we summarize here the main quantities, and they're the same as before. As noted, bias in scenario option 1 is the same as for scenario 2, option 2. Let's stick to scenario 3. We still have the situation where the missing outcome at the inference site d equals 0 is performance under assignment to treatment. Again, we look to a comparison site d equals 1 for information to infer the unobserved quantity at d equals 0. The solution we adopt for option 2 under scenario 3 is somewhat different from what researchers may be used to. We use the performance under assignment to treatment from the comparison site d equals 1 to infer what performance would be under treatment at the inference site d equals 0. That is, to infer the counterfactual performance to the treated group. Again, this is sort of like that anecdotal part that I told you. Here we are at d equals 0, having not used success for all, and then we look at this other site similar to ours that has used it and compare outcomes and draw a causal inference about it. An important point to note is that this solution really is not that different from scenario 2, option 1. That is the traditional comparison group design, where you make a cross-site comparison to infer what is not observed at the inference site. Under that scenario, we adopted performance under assignment to control from d equals 1. Here, under scenario 3, we adopt performance under assignment to treatment from d equals 1. The objecting researcher that I mentioned might take further issue with this solution. He or she might ask, why would you ever do this? Why don't you use the experimental result, the previous solution, scenario 3, option 1, which you know to be unbiased at d equals 1, instead of the seemingly inferior cross-site comparison, where it sort of intuitively feels like there's more things at play that could lead to bias. And my response to that is that we should not jump so quickly to conclusions about the better option under scenario 3. As with scenario 2, there is a trade-off between the two options for scenario 3. With option 1, the experimental result from elsewhere, it implies unconfounded assignment to conditions, but it is from over there, potentially introducing effects on confounded selection into locations, especially if there's imbalance on moderators. And you have given up some information at your inference site. That is the average performance under assignment to control. That is the black bar at the bottom left. With option 2 shown here, in which you use a non-experimental cross-site comparison involving d equals 1, you have potential for bias from selection into conditions as well as into locations, but you're making use of information you have at the inference site. In essence, you observe half the true solution for your inference site. Again, that quantity at the bottom left, which you otherwise would have given up if you had looked to an experiment done elsewhere. A preference for an experimental result from d equals 1 represents a belief that bias from selection on confounders that moderate impact is less than bias from the cross-site comparison presented as option 2 right here. And which one is better, again, might be an empirical question if we think about the WSC tradition, keep that in the back of our minds as a means to testing which one is preferable. So the objecting researcher might also argue that there would be no need for either scenario 2 or scenario 3 if I had been careful to pick and randomize my sample of interest. He or she would say, why go back to an inferior design to make up for the fact that you chose a sample that isn't the one for which you want to draw the inference? I agree that in principle, it would be best to have exactly the inference sample or one completely representative of that sample to study the question. That is the researcher's ideal. But here too, I must contrast this with the evaluator's reality, which is a predicament. He or she must often work with the sample that is in front of them. Ideally, as we often have, we can run an experiment with exactly the sample of interest. However, quite often, the sample that we have to work with is the one in front of us. And the concern that is at issue is for the stakeholders, the local stakeholders. And in many circumstances, they simply cannot run an experiment at that site. And in those situations, I would argue you must consider all available study designs and understand the conditions under which one is better than the other. So this option, I think, is fair game, where we're in that situation where some designs are preferable but are unachievable because of logistical reasons. So let's return to the impact quantity represented in this slide. So what's the bias for the situation you see here? That is for scenario 3, option 2. Net bias for this option is the difference between the lengths of the red line and the length of the green line. So the same as before. And it turns out, you can do this visually or mathematically, that bias in this case involves both EB bias and IB bias, which we have already considered in prior options and scenarios. And now they're represented in terms of the dashed blue lines. So more specifically, net bias for scenario 3, option 2 is expressed as EB bias minus IB bias. And it's represented over here in terms of the solid blue line. So it's the 2 dashed lines, the difference between them and their magnitudes in this scenario for this option. And in this case that I've illustrated here is the length of that blue line. So let's go back to the summary again. We have all of the possibilities that we've considered so far. And you'll see that at the bottom right, the most recent option that we've looked at for scenario 3 does present the quantity of interest, which is bias expressed as a difference between EB bias and IB bias. We're going to focus on the 2 results for scenario 3 a little bit more. Why? I think because scenario 3 leads to an important point about the use of experiments versus non-experiments in situations when causal generalization is the goal. Consider again the 2 options. Under scenario 3, that is when the goal is to infer impact for the site when performance under assignment to treatment is not observed. Under the experimental option, net bias is EB bias alone. Under the non-experimental option, net bias is EB bias minus IB bias. And it should be clear that when the concern is to minimize the average absolute bias, that is net bias, one option is not always better than the other. When should one be preferred over the other? I would prefer option 2, that is the non-experimental cross-site comparison, when the inequality at the bottom of the slide is true. So my objecting researcher friend raises another objection. His actual response was, with this situation, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Having 2 types of bias figure into the result is worse than just having 1. The implication being that because option 2 is susceptible to the 2 biases, it must be worse than option 1, which is susceptible to just the 1. This seems like the intuitive answer, but we see that counterintuitively, we also have to pay attention to the relationship between bias 1 and bias 2. And in some cases, 2 wrongs do make a right, in the same way that the product of 2 negatives is a positive. I want to emphasize that I'm not saying that option 2 is better most of the time, or even that it is often right. Rather, I'm saying that if it is right, even just some of the time, we should know when that is, so that we can choose the best solution for a given situation. And I think this is the right scientific response, to kind of dig deeper and understand when you want to use one versus the other. A graph of the space of EB bias and IB bias shows the shaded region in which the comparison group-based generalization, that is option 2 under scenario 3, has lower net bias than the experiment-based generalization, that is when using the results from experiment from D equals 1. One could imagine overlaying potential or possible hypothetical joint distributions of EB bias and IB bias on this graph. For example, you might imagine a circular distribution centered on the origin, which would suggest that in that case, in most cases, an experiment-based generalization is better. The coverage will be mostly of that circle would be mostly in the white region, essentially clipping the two gray zones. However, while preferable in most cases, it wouldn't be the best solution in all situations. And as a scientist, and perhaps even more as an evaluator seeking an answer for my specific situation, knowing that the experiment-based solution is best in most cases is not good enough, unless that's the best conclusion I can reach in an empirical study of the question. So I'm going to pause there, and we'll talk about the implications for internal validity and external validity in a second. However, what I did want to talk about is that in the full paper, we address some additional issues. Specifically, we will address the assumptions that so far we've ignored mostly in order to have this simplified schematic demonstration. So what are some of the assumptions that we've been making in this example for the results to be clean in the way we've described them? First of all, we assume that we're working with true values in this example, and normally we are not. We have sampling error to deal with. Secondly, the study design we've been assuming is not compromised through attrition. Thirdly, we've been talking about a very specific kind of generalization, that is across locales from site D equals 1 to D equals 0. But this kind of comparison is consistent with a version of the WSC studies called the multi-site version, in which the tests of levels of bias are made by comparing outcomes across sites in a multi-site trial. We have assumed that if an experiment is conducted at a site, everyone is randomized and outcomes are obtained for everyone. And we've assumed that if an experiment is not conducted at a site, that site is either a treatment-only site where everyone gets treatment, or a control site where no one at the site gets treatment, and outcomes are obtained for everyone. And the other point is that we've been considering, well, it's sometimes called the naive or starting causal quantities in our discussion. That is, normally you wouldn't just make these raw comparisons. You would do, use some other methods, design solutions, or especially analytic solutions and covariate adjustments to try to eliminate or reduce bias. But with WSC studies, these naive quantities are usually the starting point for quantifying bias. And then after applying those strategies, you look to see whether or not you can make improvements. And so we haven't talked about that so far. Secondly, in the paper, we provide an empirical application using a within-study comparison approach to measure bias for scenario 3. That is the two options. We compare the results of the two options. And we used achievement outcomes from the multi-site Tennessee class size reduction experiment. So specifically, assuming scenario 3, where we've looked at the two options, we compare the average magnitude of bias in the experiment-based result from elsewhere. That was what we described as option 1, or labeled option 1, and the non-experimental comparison, option 2. And the results are the average magnitudes results we show here are the average magnitudes of bias from comparisons across multiple sites, which is, again, a common WSC study variant. So the three main findings, which I'll very quickly tell you for this one WSC application, is that the experiment-based result in this situation was less biased on average than the cross-site non-experimental comparison. And that's shown by the fact that the light gray bars, which summarize bias in the option 1, are lower than the dark gray bars, which represent the average result when taking the approach for scenario 3, option 2. Secondly, in this experiment, accounting for sampling error at both the student and teacher levels gives a more accurate result than if we account for sampling error only at the level at which the outcome was evaluated, that is, for students at the top. So here, the bottom panel is the result when we figure in sampling error at the teacher level, and the top panel is the result when we don't figure in the teacher effect. And so we see that the more dramatic effect is really on the light gray bars, which is scenario 3, option 1. That is the experimental comparison, where you're adopting experimental result from somewhere else. And a third major result was that adjusting for interactions between site level covariates and treatment reduced bias. And we see this in terms of the 2 rightmost bars in the top panel and the bottom panel. Those tend to be lower than what we see in the pairs of bars on the left side. So the 2 rightmost bars are lower than the rest. And so you can get into, see the details of that in the paper and the analytic approach we used and so on. So the other thing we do in this paper is we discuss a couple of important implications of this work. And we'll briefly talk about them here. Okay, so what I show you here is we're going to talk about one of the implications. It involves how we think about internal and external validity. And so it's a taste of one of the implications. So here what we have is just simply the table that we showed before with some slightly different details, but in a different display, but nothing new that you haven't already seen. So it's clear to me that for scenario 1, which was the randomized experiment at the inference site, and scenario 2, option 1, which was the traditional cross-site comparison, and sort of your standard comparison group design application, causal generalization of the treatment effect is not a concern. It's my assertion. And why? I would say that because we're inferring impact at the site where the treatment is already being implemented. So the problem is not to generalize impact, but to establish a valid counterfactual to treatment at the inference site. It's clear to me that in scenario 2, option 2, and in scenario 3, options 1 and 2, causal generalization is the concern. Why? Because in these cases, we use observed performance under assignment to treatment from somewhere else, that is from D equals 1, in order to infer impact at D equals 0. So let's think about the implications of that if we accept that assertion. It means that the problem of internal validity bias as the only source of bias from selection arises only when causal generalization is not a concern. Otherwise, when causal generalization is a concern, that is what we mark here for the scenarios and options that are in pink, the problem of internal validity bias either does not arise or it arises only in relation to external validity bias. An implication of this, I believe, is that the assertion that internal validity takes priority over external validity holds only in the case where external validity is not at issue. So I have to kind of ponder that for a little bit. I would argue that this is analogous to choosing internal validity as the winner of a race in the situation where internal validity is the only runner. When generalizability is the concern, that is when internal validity bias and external validity bias are both in the running, then in terms of the logic here, neither one is first. That is, they must be considered simultaneously. There's more discussion of that in the paper, and this is the kind of stuff that I would love to get feedback on, because traditionally there has been this argument made of internal validity being the sine qua non, without which you cannot proceed to draw conclusions about causal effects across conditions. And this is a way of formulating the idea that, in fact, if you are going to talk about internal validity as the prior, that you really are limited in the context that you're talking about. That, in fact, in the real world, where you must generalize any conclusions, unless you're interested only in the result from that experiment, both need to be considered simultaneously. This point has been made somewhat loosely by saying there are trade-offs to validity and so on. And here, hopefully, we've made this conclusion, or drawn this conclusion a little more rigorously by formulating it using WSC methodology. The other important implication, which we show and discuss in the paper, is that scenario 3, option 2, in which we generalize through a comparison across sites, is potentially less biased than scenario 3, option 1, that is, where we use an experiment from somewhere else, for programs that have larger positive impact among individuals who perform lower in the absence of the program. And this has implications for using criteria of equity selecting study designs. I think I'll leave it at that, but the idea is that this second option under scenario 3 may be more useful, may generate accurate results a little more frequently in cases where a program is having greater impact for individuals who perform less well in the absence of treatment. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. The full paper is available as a preprint on Sage Advance, and the link is here, and also is provided in the blog that you would have accessed this presentation through. I invite you to comment on any of the material. Please leave me a note. And I'm especially looking for ideas that would help me to further refine the argument or find limitations or faults in the argument. And my goal is to advance the applications of this idea going forward. Thank you for your time.